The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 1091 Dragon Fire. There were countless races in the universe, more than Lex could ever know. Of them, there were surely many who were monstrously powerful, perhaps even more so than dragons. The celestial race was one such example. If looked at only using face value, then dragons were born as earth immortals, but celestials were born in the celestial immortal level. By that comparison, they were much more powerful, and indeed their influence was unquestionable. Lex knew this because the small bits of information the rhinocentaurs provided often mentioned them and their celestial court. But while they were incredibly powerful, Lex knew no distinguishing features about them save that they looked very similar to humans. Similarly, the other powerful races he knew all had incredible powers, such as the devil's unquestionable control over demons, but no race seemed to be as well known as the dragons. Who did not know about their insatiable greed? Who did not know about their unquestionable strength? Who did not cower when they brought their might to bear? Similar to all those things, the fame of Dragon's Breath was also unsurpassed. It was their most powerful attack, and thus, it was incomparable, and could not be suppressed. Even though Lex was merely using a glyph, and was recreating the weakest version of Dragon Fire, and could barely be considered a training aid for actual dragons, within the nascent realm even this contained devastating destructive capabilities. Not only did every single one of the tree's defenses vaporize upon coming into contact with the crimson flames, even the energy used to create those techniques became chaotic and berserk, breaking free of the tree's control, and causing it to suffer a minor cultivation deviation. But before it could even feel the effects of such a thing, or rather, before it would even register that something had gone amiss with its cultivation, the tree came into contact with the flames. The damage was not limited to its soul at all, as its entire body burst into flames so suddenly. It was as if someone used a flamethrower to light a tanker of crude oil on fire. The resulting explosion was so massive that Lex's instincts finally tingled a sense of danger, and he immediately teleported the battalion away. Arrays used the energy of the universe to sustain themselves. Spiritual techniques used the energy of the cultivator to give birth to astonishing phenomena. Formations used items and treasures in specific arrangements to bring about certain effects in a specific region. All of them were incredible, but none of them created something new, they were just replicating things that already existed in the universe. All existence, then, was dictated by their associated laws. Talk to the hand was one of the techniques he learned, and it created a barrier in front of his hand. Evisceration was one of his favorite attacks, but it used the eyes. What was the difference between using hands and using eyes to bring about an external result? He had many states of mind which allowed him to think in various ways, such as flow, overdrive and berserk, but at the end of the way it was still his mind doing all that thinking, so why did he need so many techniques? Impervious hands was a technique he originally learned because its defense was ridiculously high, but practically he kept using it because it offered so many other benefits. He learned Inferno Blade because he wanted new attacks and to train his sword intent, but in actuality he was now using it to gauge whether he was ready to become an immortal or not. Nothing was ever straightforward. Everything had obvious benefits, but more than that, they had hidden benefits that only those smart or lucky enough to realize them could unlock. All these thoughts and millions more ran through Lex's mind in a fraction of a second, and he used all of them to, for the first time ever, create his own technique. Chapter 1092 Dawn and Dusk. There was no time. Everything happened too quickly. Lex and the tree were fighting, and the tree was losing, but not fast enough. Lex decided to use a stronger technique to speed things up. Somehow, that had brought about an apocalyptic event that threatened to eradicate an entire continent. If blame had to be assigned, Lex thoroughly allocated it on the tree. Why was it fighting so hard? If it had just sat there and let Lex win, none of this would have happened. But a debate on why some people were just unreasonable was pointless, so it was best not to dwell on it. Lex did not understand how techniques worked. Or at least, he did not understand why making them in certain ways within one's body brought about certain effects. Some people created techniques without understanding the why. As long as they could understand the effects, that's all that mattered. But such a mentality left room for unknown flaws, and so Lex did not subscribe to such a method. Instead, he focused not on the manipulation of spiritual energy, but of laws instead. For some reason, it was a lot easier for him to do that. Wasn't he essentially just manipulating the effects of laws when he created laws anyway? Once he began creating the technique, inspiration just kept coming, and he realized that what was before him was not a calamity, but an amazing opportunity. Lex moved, and activated his newly created technique, which he immediately named Heaven's Furnace. An invisible barrier formed around the tree, coating it like a second skin, just in time for the bright light to end. Then the explosion happened. But instead of a shockwave shooting through the realm, the explosion was contained perfectly within the barrier Lex had created. The strength of the initial explosion was such that nothing Lex had ever created before could block it even for a fraction of a second, yet Heaven's Furnace stayed strong. It had to, after all, since a furnace's sole purpose was to contain heat and pressure. Perhaps such a thing was to be expected. How could the influence of not one but several Tao-level ingredients be limited to solely potential? But no matter how the tree bashed against the barrier, it did not budge. Considering that the barrier was the original size of the tree, and yet now the tree was lost within the flames, banging against the barrier for release, it was evident how much of the tree had already burned away. Cracks began to form on Lex's skin as he struggled to maintain the technique, and keep the size of the barrier shrinking. Blood started to seep out of his nose and ears. Even with his great self-control, he could not keep himself from grunting and groaning each time the tree smashed the barrier. But the barrier itself never once wavered. Besides light, the barrier allowed nothing else to escape. The ground did not so much as tremble when the explosions happened, and no one felt the tree's dying throes. There was just the visage of a tree-shaped explosion, growing smaller slowly, forming a breathtakingly beautiful sight. It was as if a tree made entirely of swirling flames and replaced the tree of heaven. For a time, Minara bathed in the glow of the burning tree, replicating the lights and colors of a beautiful dawn, and eventually, a breathtaking dusk. For 2 whole months, Lex kept the barrier in place, slowly shrinking it. Finally, when it reached just 2 feet in size, the pressure finished. What remained was a flame, still swirling and filled with all the colors of the sky, and fixed in the final shape of the tree of heaven. Lex let the barrier collapse, finally, and approached the small tree made entirely of fire. He was hesitant at first, but from the tree he felt no danger, no heat. All he felt was a welcoming warmth. He touched it, and it was barely lukewarm in temperature. But much more warning than that was the sound of a notification he heard. Lex read it, and despite his horrendous state, smiled. Chapter 1093. Good day. New notification, unique grade ingredient, heavenly tree of dragon fire detected. Absorb ingredient to repair the system? It was a very simple notification, yet at the same time, it was immensely informative. Previously, the ingredients he found were either heavenly, celestial, or Tao-level ingredients. But the heavenly tree of dragon fire was rated as unique. He did not know where on the scale that fell, but he was hoping that it would be enough. He only needed 3% more and his quest would be complete. It was both very close, and very far. Lex accepted the prompt, and the tree of fire disappeared, absorbed into the system. Over the past couple of months Lex had been completely occupied using Heaven's Furnace, to the point where he could not be distracted at all. He had thoroughly underestimated the vitality of the tree, as it stayed alive right up until the very end, despite being trapped inside such a deadly inferno. He felt that while his estimate of the tree's combat strength was accurate, he had underestimated how difficult it would be to kill. It only made sense. Is it over? Leonidas asked, walking up to Lex. Over the past couple of months, the battalion had made its way back to Lex and protected him the entire time in case he was attacked. It would have hardly mattered as his defense was incredible, but it would not have been a pleasant experience, which is why Lex was grateful for their help. They'd also used this time to finish their own objectives as well. Being teleported away mid-battle had been surprising, but when they saw what state the tree had been brought to, they were quite understanding. But their job was quite a bit easier than they expected, because most zealots of the tree, or the most devoted worshippers, died on their own, leaving behind only shriveled bodies, as if they had been sucked dry of everything. After that, all the forces of the various countries under the shade of the tree were crippled on their own, leaving the battalion with nothing to do. While it was clear to many that those who had died had their energies absorbed by the tree in a bid for survival, others blamed the battalion, so it wasn't like protecting Lex was a walk in the park. But they suffered no casualties, which was all that mattered. "Yes, it's over," Lex said, then turned to look around him. The tree was truly massive, and as it had suddenly disappeared, an enormous hole had been left in the place where it once stood. But that was far from the extent of the repercussions of its sudden departure. Lex could feel that the tree's absence would affect everything from tectonic movements, to weather, the development of the entire continent's civilizations, as well as the spiritual energy. Rather than decreasing, the concentration of spiritual energy on the continent was actually increasing, and quite noticeably. It seemed that the tree had been monopolizing all that energy, but since it couldn't cultivate further, Lex had no idea what else it was doing with that energy. But at the same time, he didn't care. To be more specific, as long as the tree was truly dead and hadn't left behind any clones or means or revival, he didn't care. He tapped into his instincts, trying to determine if he could still feel the existence of the tree, but they were silent. Vera and her mother were sitting at a table nearby, playing cards, of all things. Harry and his wife were in another corner, talking to a group of friends. Of all things, John was even here, though he was sitting alone and scribbling something on a notebook. There were a few other new and old faces, but Lex was suddenly taken back to the first few days of the inn. It had all been so hectic back then, yet looking back, for all the stress he had endured back then, they were good times. Lex smiled, and took a sip of his coffee, taking in its rich, aromatic flavors. "This is pretty good," Lex said. Gerard only nodded, and went to serve someone else. Lex didn't talk much. He didn't go and join any other conversations. He just sat there and enjoyed the pleasant environment. Who knew what the future held, but at least the present was pretty good. Lex thought back to some of his old guests. It had been a while since he had seen Old Man Will or Helen, or that lazy sloth that had given him so much trouble back then. He wondered how they were all doing. There was also little Tiffany, who had grown up. As the chosen one of a planet, her life was probably very hectic, right? Everyone else probably also had a lot of things keeping them busy, maybe stressing them out. But it was only with such a busy, hectic life that one could appreciate the charm of the Midnight Inn. It allowed them to take a small pause from the troubles of their life, take a small break, recover, and then move on. Lex suddenly had an impulsive whim to open the inn back up to everyone. Keeping the inn closed was a real disservice to everyone who needed a vacation. But it was just an impulsive thought, he couldn't actually do it. He had to strengthen himself first, at least till he was ready to become an immortal. Lex took another sip, and looked around the room. Everything was so peaceful. It was quite nice, but he couldn't help but miss Marlowe. Sometimes, a little crazy energy was also quite rejuvenating. "I'm too young to be feeling so nostalgic," Lex murmured to himself, and took another sip of the coffee. Why was it so damn good? How had he never thought of trying this before? But after another hour, even the coffee began to fail Lex, and he was forced to bid farewell to the relaxing environment of the bar and retire to his bedroom. After a quick shower, he threw himself to bed. Chapter 1094 Barrage of Notifications. The next week should have been very relaxing for Lex, considering he just had to wait for the system to finish absorbing the heavenly tree of dragon fire, but that was far from what actually happened. Once he recovered from his exhaustion, Lex spent a little time relaxing and cultivating, but that had its limits, so he returned to the inn to see if there were things that required his attention. For the most part, the inn had completely recovered from the attack. All was well, or at least, that's how it appeared on the surface. But the fluctuations that the realm experienced hadn't gone unnoticed by the various guests. Knowledgeable and experienced as they were, many guests immediately realized what had happened. The realm was too weak to contain the strength of an Earth immortal. Unfortunately, that led to a lot of speculation. The various guests who wanted to leave began to secretly meet and discuss if the weakness of the realm was the real reason the innkeeper had disappeared. If that was the case, this presented a few opportunities. Some were beginning to consider if they could return to where they came from if they destabilized the realm enough, while others began to consider the potential gains of monopolizing an entire new realm. The only risk was that sooner or later, the innkeeper would find a way to get revenge even if he could not enter the realm, not to mention they had no real confirmation if that was the case to begin with. The threat of the innkeeper was the only thing keeping them from taking action, but that didn't change the fact that they were still whispering about it. The only reason Lex discovered this to begin with was the increased potency of his instincts. The Midnight Inn was supposed to have a malicious intent detection system, though Lex did not think it was working properly. It hardly ever detected anyone who actually had the means to do harm to the inn, just some low-level miscreants. But now, his instincts were displaying similar characteristics. Even though they were not specifically targeting Lex in their considerations, the inn was closely related to Lex, and so he picked up on it. After that, well, all he had to do was spy on the thoughts of some of them to discover what was going on. He made sure to only target those weaker than himself so he wouldn't get caught, and then kept an eye on them. Although initially he felt some sympathy for these guests who had been sort of kidnapped, that was no longer the case. Now, Lex was just patiently waiting for the system to return to functionality so he could kick them out and ban them. That didn't change the fact that there were countless immortals teetering on the edge of turning against him. That is why his week was spent monitoring the rebellious group and noting down their names. There was a chance that this was not everyone, and that some were even more cautious about it, but Lex could do nothing about that for now. But, on the 8th day, Lex heard the one sound he had been waiting for, and immediately checked his notification. A wide grin appeared on his face as he read it. T from. New notification, Heavenly Tree of Dragon Fire absorbed. System repaired 8%. System functionality at 40.2%. Quest complete, system failure detected. Immediately restore the system to minimum 35% functionality before permanent system shutdown. Quest reward, return of normal system functions. Remarks, why were you taking mini vacations while I was struggling to keep the system running? New notification, teleportation functions back online. All normal day-to-day services back online. New notification, due to the system regaining 40% functionality, new features have been unlocked. New features. 1. Guest satisfaction rating. 2. 0 to 1 body tempering event. 3. 0 to 1 chi training event. 4. 0 of 1 foundation realm event. 5. 0 of 1 golden core event. 6. 0/1 nascent soul event. Quest reward, Midnight Inn branch upgrade, tavern. Remarks, I heard you need your employees' help to get a date. No wonder you drink every time you see a bar. New notification, absorbing systems below rank B- will no longer upgrade system functionality. Oh boy, there was a lot to unpack here. New features, interesting new upgrades, quality of life improvements, new quests that honestly did not seem to be as difficult as he was expecting, and much more. He even missed the system's attitude. But, before doing any of that, Lex equipped the newly upgraded host attire, and searched for all the guests who wanted to leave the inn, as well as those who were considering monopolizing the realm for themselves. If nothing else, the malicious intent function was working a lot better, because he could easily identify everyone who was planning on taking advantage of the innkeeper's absence. With a wave of his hand, he kicked them all out, and banned them from ever coming back. Then, with another wave of his hand, everyone who wanted to leave the inn was also sent back. At the same time, all the buildings that had been repaired by the workers, but were left with tiny or barely noticeable imperfections were all fixed. The terrain, the ground, the roads, and public transport were all immediately repaired as well. At the same time, every single personal assistant for every guest was upgraded, so that they would inform the guests that the teleportation function was temporarily back online. If anyone wanted to leave now, they could do so. In fact, they were encouraged to do so because the teleportation services were going to be shut down in a few days once again, and this time they might be closed for years. If anyone wanted to stay back, not only did they need to pay for a deposit for their long stay, they also had to agree to the fact that they would not cause any issues until teleportation functions were turned back on. If they decided to stay, but then caused issues later on, they would be permanently banned from the inn. Everyone was surprised by the sudden changes, and for a moment thought that the innkeeper had returned. But Lex did not reappear as the innkeeper, and remained hidden. After all, he wanted to focus on all the new notifications he got, and take his time understanding the new features one by one. Like an excited little boy about to unwrap his Christmas presents, Lex rubbed his hands together and pulled up the interface and began going through everything. With the return of the teleportation function, new guests were able to come to the inn from outside again, but he intended to use a token to seal the inn soon, so that was the least of his concerns. He began going through the new features for now. First off was the guest satisfaction rating. From now on, the experience of each guest would be recorded and automatically tabulated. Lex could check individual as well as cumulative satisfaction ratings. If his satisfaction rating fell, Lex froze. This was not so much an upgrade as it was a sort of setback. If his cumulative guest satisfaction fell below a certain rating, it would affect his ability to use MP and MT. Basically, it added a condition to his use of money. Maybe this was something that should have existed from the get-go, but since Lex never needed to worry about this before, its sudden arrival was a huge downer. Especially since right now he had just kicked out thousands of unsatisfied guests. The fact that they were unsatisfied, and the fact that he had kicked them out both contributed to lowering the cumulative results. He was currently only at 62%. Chapter 1095 New Features. Lex groaned. Of course nothing was ever easy. He focused on the details to learn more. The lower his guest satisfaction rating, the more expensive things would be to buy using MP. It was a very straightforward relationship, and yet extremely effective. What's the point of this? It wasn't as if I was not looking after my guests' experiences, he lamented, but there was no one to give him an answer. Well, he did just kick out and ban a bunch of guests because they irritated him. But in his defense, they were planning on acting against the inn. Just for a comparison, he checked the price of a regular room. Ordinarily, it cost him 500 MP to buy it, but with his current satisfaction rating it cost 806 MP. It was not too bad, but he could see how, when applied across hundreds or thousands of purchases, even a price increase of 1 MP could cost him an immense amount. This added a new hurdle to manage, but it wasn't so bad. He was confident he could quickly raise the satisfaction rating, not to mention that if the cumulative satisfaction rating was about 95% he would gain access to special perks. Next, he turned his attention to the upgrades to the host attire. For one, it no longer needed to be an entire ensemble, but rather a single clothing item. That did not seem like much of an upgrade until Lex saw that the attire now had an active and passive mode. In active mode the attire would take on its normal appearance, and Lex would look like the innkeeper to any who saw him. But in the inactive mode, Lex would still look like Lex, but with the added benefit that he could still completely and thoroughly control the inn, like he could while wearing the attire. This included when he was not actually inside the inn. But outside the inn, the attire would only remain in its inactive mode, and so Lex could not pretend to be the innkeeper. It was a nice upgrade, considering that it would keep him connected to the inn basically all the time now. Mostly, it was just a replacement for the fact that the system was supposed to fuse with his soul by now. Much more interesting than the first two was the third new feature, which was realm law replication. Basically, just like how the inn had various different biomes to support various different guests, such as lakes for aquatic guests, temples for divine guests and so on, the realm could now replicate the laws of certain realms to accommodate guests who could only survive in very specific conditions. One example of unusual laws was the place Lex visited just a few months ago, where he turned into a 2D character. Although it was technically still this realm, the laws within that small region were completely different. One of the primary reasons for that was that the Midnight Realm itself was brand new, and far from stabilizing, so the laws that governed the realm had not been fully established. That meant there was a certain possibility that the laws that turned the world 2D might actually take over the realm. The next feature, the in-level division, was actually one that made a lot of sense and he had been wondering about for a while. At the moment, the spiritual energy concentration in the inn was quite pure and high, which was beneficial to everyone. But that was also because everyone here were either locals or suitably powerful. Such a high energy concentration would actually be quite dangerous for weaker guests. That is where the level division would come in. It was great that he got a lot more land, because now he would need to develop more of the inn. Starting from level 0, which basically had the same amount of spirit energy as Earth, if only a little purer, all the way to level 5, which matched his authority level, the inn would be divided into various levels. The spiritual energy in each level would be different, but at the same time, so would be the cost of living there. For example, 1 MP is equal to $1,000 from back on Earth, which effectively meant that most humans on Earth would never be able to actually afford living here. But now, on level 1, the price would be drastically reduced, so that normal guests could also afford it. Of course, guests who had high cultivation levels but were on a budget could also choose to reside in a lower level. Basically, the inn was now accommodating all price ranges, which meant a lot more guests could actually come here. These were just the newest features that had been added. Various existing services had been improved, though he did not know the details, and some of the loopholes he depended on had been fixed. This included the issue with teleportation. Previously, many guests would sneak into the inn from places they weren't supposed to be in, and then teleport back when they needed to do something devious. Many robberies had been committed like this, not to mention assassinations and other crimes. Being complicit to such criminal activities was not really the best for the inn's image, so Lex addressed the issue, but it was far from ideal. Now the system fixed it on its own. Anyone could teleport to the inn from anywhere, that was still true, so technically criminals could still use it to escape. But if guests tried to teleport back, they would not be sent exactly back to the same location, unless they had permission or were supposed to be there. If they did not have permission to return to the place they teleported from originally, they would just be sent to a public spot nearby. That was still similar to the change that Lex made, but what was different was that guests could now purchase a permanent teleportation point. That meant that they could choose to return to that permanent spot instead of where they arrived from. This was not a perfect solution, and actually made it easier for criminals to get away, but Lex guessed the system wasn't thinking about that when it added the feature. Chapter 1096 Easy. The upgrade to the features was nice. It also indicated that as the system's functionality was being repaired, its performance was also increasing. Even this was only at 40% functionality. Lex could not even imagine what would happen if the system reached 50%, or even 100%. On top of everything, Lex's system authority had also increased to level 5. That was incredibly useful, as he could now purchase even more things from the system directly. More powerful and diverse formations, get more detailed answers from Mary, as well as exercise his control over more aspects of the inn. Although the notification about his authority increase was the simplest, it was perhaps the most useful. That only left behind the 3 quests he had been given altogether. But even if he had been given 3 quests at once, Lex did not feel pressured or alarmed by them. Instead, not only did they seem pretty easy to accomplish, they also seemed very interesting. They also seemed designed especially for the latest application of his tavern. The first quest was to provide materials that could strengthen the laws within the inn's territory. Lex had a strong suspicion that the system could easily get them if it wished, but was delegating the task to Lex to make him suffer. But the thing was, both lightning tribulation shards and space crystals were things he could easily get. In fact, Vera had only recently reminded him that there were countless oracles still within the inn who were requesting his service to remove lightning shards from their souls. In fact, that was one of the first things he planned on doing. Now that a bunch of guests had been sent out of the inn, the news that the inn had an entirely new realm all to itself would spread. that would, inevitably, attract some kind of trouble. That was one of the reasons why he wanted to close the inn as quickly as possible. But having it open for a short time offered many advantages that he wanted to avail. In short, the first quest was not nearly as difficult as it was made out to be. He even intended to complete it as quickly as possible to get the best possible reward. Then came the second quest. It was hard to determine how easy or difficult this would be. Theoretically, it should be pretty easy. He just needed to find some guests on the verge of dying and save them, or maybe lend weak guests a cultivation technique or something along those lines. With the tavern traveling from place to place, within 5 years, it shouldn't be difficult to change the destiny of just 100 people. That finally left the third quest, which was to attend 6 events, each specifically focused on a different cultivation level. This again did not seem hard. With access to countless worlds, finding 6 measly events over the course of 5 years should not be hard at all. The only thing that Lex was slightly curious about was whether those 5 years were in the Midnight Realm or outside. Since time flowed 3 times faster in the Midnight Realm than in the Origin Realm, if he only had 5 years here, then that would equate to a little more than a year in the Origin Realm. Whereas if it were 5 years in the Origin Realm, it would be equal to 15 years here. Considering he intended to use the tavern to complete the quests, he hoped it followed the timeline of the Origin Realm, but he had a feeling that was too much to ask for. Lastly, there was the restriction on the grade of systems he could absorb. It was a predictable issue, considering what happened with the resin. But it wasn't urgent, so he'd deal with it in the future. Chapter 1097 Favorite Kind of Troubles. Speaking of 5 years, there was another matter as well. Vera had given him a prophecy, and told him that he needed to visit a specific planet in exactly 5 years. Those 5 years, he was sure, referred to Origin Realm years, so that was something he needed to keep in mind. With various different time flows to deal with now, keeping track of time in each realm would be something that required conscious effort. At last, there was one final thing he needed to consider and decide before once again sealing the inn. Should he send his clone out into the Origin Realm, or keep it here within the Midnight Realm? There were benefits to both, which is why this was something he had been unable to instantly decide. He could only deliberate it over the next few days. With all his decisions made, Lex began to act. Time was of the essence. He wanted to minimize his time as much as possible, but how long that was depended on how quickly the Infinity Emporium provided him with the embers. Lex teleported back to X-142 and was about to head into the Emporium when he paused, and itched his nose. After spending so much time in the Midnight Realm, coming back to the Origin Realm made him feel slightly nauseous. Considering the fact that he was in the nascent realm, making him feel anything was a considerable task. But this nausea was not random. It was only now that he had returned to the Origin Realm that he realized how impure its spirit energy felt. It was not something he had noticed before. But why was that the case? He had never noticed anything wrong with the spiritual energy here before, nor had he heard anyone complain. Sure, there were some places with higher and lower energy concentrations, but that was normal. But his instincts told him that this was a matter he should pay attention to, but it wasn't dangerous. Lex rubbed his nose, as if clearing something out, before returning to normal. The nausea faded, but he could not forget that it had been there to begin with. Lex walked into the Emporium, and could not help but notice that the energy here was much purer. "You said there were 2 of these?" he asked. Yes. Actually, there were going to be more, but for that you would need to actively participate in marketing. With just 2, you have no obligation to do anything. Havalier Industries just hopes that if you participate in any more interstellar warfare, you can record a few videos for marketing purposes. This is excellent. I'll happily take one, and I think you deserve to have the other. Powell was stunned, and looked at Lex in shock. No, this is yours, how could I? Yes, it's mine. And I'm giving you one as a gift for helping me get such a good deal. Since it's mine, I can give it as a gift, right? I guess, Powell said, trying to hide his own excitement. He was clearly a little awkward about this, but the fact that he liked the gift was enough for Lex. The Emporium had been integral in his journey, so building better relations with Powell was not a bad idea. Moreover, it didn't cost him anything either. Now Powell, I'd like to stay and chat with you here about this, but I'm afraid I'm in a bit of a time crunch, as I usually am. The list of items I need this time are not easy, but I brought an advance payment. 3 drops of mountain milk. Powell was startled, and then his eyes gleamed. How could he ever forget why he loved Lex so much? He was always a big spender. First, I need all the information you have on fairies. Secondly, I just came back from another realm, and I can't help but notice that the energy in this realm seems polluted, for some reason. If you have any information about that, I'd like to purchase all related information. I need 1,000 fire tribulation embers. Oh, also, I need a comprehensive instruction manual about treasure manufacturing, formations, pill refinement. The list of things Lex needed this time was extremely extensive, which was really troubling. But Powell wished he would face these kinds of troubles every day. Chapter 1098 Finally meeting. 10 days? Lex repeated, as he thought about the deadline. That was a lot longer than Lex was hoping to keep the inn open. What if by then a Henali wanted to visit his new realm? It can't be helped, Powell said, feeling embarrassed. The other items you've listed, while numerous, will take only a few days. But the fire tribulation embers need to be collected freshly and stored in a special container. They will not last long once removed from the source, which is why we have none in store. Besides the fire tribulation embers, Lex had also asked for books and resources comprehensively explaining various cultivation concepts. This was not actually expensive, because Lex had a perpetual deal ongoing with the Emporium, who were still providing him with golden core techniques. Frankly, there probably weren't enough golden core techniques in existence to compensate Lex for the amount he was owed, so he just switched them from golden core techniques to a much larger list of subjects. Since he planned on shutting down the inn for a long time, he wanted all possible knowledge he could need so that he wouldn't be left in need but without means. Personally, he could rely on Pell, but he didn't want to place all his eggs in one basket. Moreover, this would help the rest of his workers, not to mention that the Midnight Library still seemed incredibly bare, so it would help to fill that. Well, do what you can. I'll pay more if you can hurry up the delivery. I'll check in regularly. Powell looked like he was struggling, but Lex didn't mind him. He had too many other things to do. Since there were, give or take, 10 days that the inn would be open, he immediately sent as many of his workers as he could to the Temple of Fasting to make best use of this time. Meanwhile, Lex returned to the inn and went over the document Powell had handed him regarding the spiritual energy purity. It seemed like this was common knowledge. Spiritual energy purity was a double-edged sword. As it turned out, it was functionally impossible to maintain an extremely high energy purity. Just as he was about to call on his ever-helpful holographic assistant, Mary appeared in front of him on her own, this time wearing a NASCAR driver costume. There are some guests here who want to talk to you, she said, as she summoned a projection of an F1 car for her to lean against. The innkeeper hasn't officially returned yet. I'm not seeing anyone, Lex said. They're not here to see the innkeeper. They're here to see you, Lex Williams. Maybe I shouldn't start with that. Your ancestors are here to see you. Considering that your ancestor looks just like you, and a lot of people have started to recognize you, they've more or less confirmed that you're here somewhere. Of course, it's up to you whether you want to meet with them or not. On instinct, Lex was about to dismiss them. He did not care much for the William family. But then he paused. His family issue was not one that was going to disappear overnight, and ignoring it wouldn't do anything either. Not to mention that he was much stronger now, and had more self-confidence. Of course, it was not to the level of facing his ancestor, who was apparently a heavenly immortal. But at the risk of decreasing his satisfaction rating a little more, he could always just eject the guy from the inn and ban him. It seemed like there wasn't any danger in facing him anymore, so he might as well just do it. All right, tell them I'll meet with them. Who else is here besides William? It was a redundant question. He already knew the answer, since the moment he paid attention to them, he found out everything. It's just William and Jotun. Chapter 1099 Bubbling Anger. Lex really thought that he'd have felt a lot of emotions when he finally confronted his family members, but to be honest, he did not. The only thing he felt was a mild irritation, and a desire to get it over with. Keeping that in mind, Lex directly teleported over to them. He did not prepare specially for the meeting. He did not don his suit. In fact, he didn't even maintain the illusion that kept his appearance from seeming older. As nothing but a toddler wearing shorts and a t-shirt, Lex teleported over to the Emperor as well as his ancestor. They were at the Midnight Manor, reading the guest registry, which had only just restarted working. A lot of names had been shuffled, but Lex's name remained right at the top. Lex's sudden appearance was, of course, not unnoticed by the two, but for a moment they failed to realize that this was the person who they were looking for. But, besides his physique, Lex was not trying to hide anything, so through blood resonance they immediately identified Lex. "I hear you're looking for me," Lex said, his tone bland. Normally, Lex would be warm and enthusiastic, regardless of what the meeting was for, but at the moment he was really not in the mood. "Are you Lex?" William asked, hesitantly. "You look different from what I had imagined." "I hold no responsibility for your imagination," Lex answered simply. Okay, so maybe he was slightly enjoying being bitter and unreasonable. Lex blamed his baby hormones for it entirely. "Your bone age and soul age are different," Jotun commented insightfully. "Have you suffered some grave injury recently? Is that why you shifted to a new body?" "But no, the bloodline of this body is the same." "Did you recreate your body? Or clone it?" Lex resisted the urge to sigh. Normally, he would find some clever way to explain how he had become a meat patty and then healed back into human form, but as previously stated, he was not in a chatty mood. But he had to admit that Jotun seemed very knowledgeable, which only made sense considering he was the emperor to such a massive empire. "How can I help you both?" Lex asked, instead of answering the question. "I am quite busy and have many things to do. I'd like to get this over with as quickly as possible." Jotun glanced at William, who nodded and took over the conversation. "Well, actually there are many things we can help each other with, even within our own private capacity. To start with, it seems like you have some misunderstandings with your immediate family. Perhaps we can." "Misunderstandings?" "That's one way of phrasing being lied to my whole life as. I realize that I don't even know if anything those people told me is the truth at all. Did I even have sisters? Are those even my real parents?" "No, William, I have no interest in listening to explanations, especially from someone else. If Leon and Serene wished to clarify things, they had many years to do so. I am not interested in someone else coming and giving justifications on their behalf. If there's something else, you should mention it now. Or else, I think we're done here." The ever-calm Lex was no longer calm, as he let his anger get the better of him. An image of a sword reappeared in his eye after a long time, fueling his emotions even more, which was immediately spotted by Jotun and William both. "I see," Jotun said carefully. "Well, there are still other things we can offer you. I will leave this here for you to check in your own time. Once you've had time to consider things, we can meet again." Jotun placed an envelope on the table in front of Lex, and then stood up alongside William. "We won't bother you more right now, though we hope that the next time we come, you can indulge us with one more meeting. Also, you might want to get that sword looked at. If you wish, I can help you with that as well." Lex's anger, which was bubbling out of control, suddenly cooled down as he forced himself into the flow state. It had been a while since he lost control of his emotions and let the sword take over. He had almost forgotten about it. Jotun's reminder immediately calmed him down, but perhaps their departure was for the best. Lex only nodded, and put the envelope away before teleporting back to his meditation room. Understandably, his emotions were a mess. Slowly, he let go of his flow state, and began to meditate. Back in the Midnight Manor, Jotun and William began discussing their plans among themselves. If Lex really had the bloodline mutation they suspected, then they had to build a good relationship with him. This was best taken slowly, lest they mess up. Fortunately, William had anticipated the possibility that Lex might not be very receptive to them considering the unusual circumstances with his family, so this was not a real setback. That envelope was just one of many plans he had made to build a good relationship between them. Chapter 1100 Once again. It took several hours for Lex to regain his calm, and once he finished his meditation, Lex could not help but frown. It had been a long time since he lost control and had the sword show up. But this was a reminder that just because a problem stopped appearing for a while did not mean it had gone away. He needed to work on his sword intent and make this sword go away. But much more than that, Lex was disappointed in himself. Was this all it took to get under his skin? It was understandable if he got angry when his inn was attacked, or his workers, but just a random mention of his parents was enough to set him off? It didn't feel good to have such a glaring weakness. He had no interest in going looking for people who had essentially abandoned him, at least originally he didn't. But today his anger had even spilled over to his sisters. This showed that this was not something he had been ignoring because he was over it, but rather because he was hiding from it. He didn't want to face it. But now that he realized that he didn't want to face it, that left him with no choice but to face it head-on. After all, that's what Lex did with all his weaknesses. It was the reason he kept looking for volcanoes, and the reason he kept pushing himself to face adventures and dangerous situations. If he had a weak mentality he would have stopped exploring new worlds right after nearly getting killed by zombies back on Vegua Minima. Or right after getting chased by wolves in Nibiru. Or any of the countless near-death experiences. Lex paused. Was he brave, or did he have some special kind of crazy that kept looking for near-death experiences? No, he wasn't crazy. It was completely normal to want to hone oneself on the razor's edge between life and death. He paused again. That definitely sounded a little concerning. But he felt fine. In short, he decided to face William and Jotun again, but not right now. He would face them right before the inn closed, as he had other things he wanted to focus on right now. He had already tied up loose ends in the Origin Realm before leaving to the Midnight Realm, so there wasn't much for him to do there. For the next few days all he needed to do was ensure that everyone who came into the inn knew that he would seal it soon. But whether it was coincidence, or because the inn had been sealed for so long, the resurgence of guests coming to the inn was massive. The devil tried to hide it, but Lex had become excellent at such things, and was able to detect even the slightest of hints from his body language, his aura, and the way his spiritual energy behaved. The devil was absolutely ecstatic. The meeting Loretta requested seemed to be regarding something deeply important to her. The fact that she had come back with Creel must have meant that it was related to the inn, since the devil was the one who had gone to report to her. Considering the fact that the inn had moved to an entire new realm, and Creel had likely witnessed the birth of the entire realm, there were any number of things he could have gone to report to Loretta. But something told him this matter had something to do with his physique. He put the matter of meeting Loretta aside and continued to manage the inn secretly, until all 10 days in the Origin Realm passed, and the Emporium managed to gather everything. Despite their best efforts, they were not able to speed up the process of getting the embers, so Powell did not get his extra commission. Regardless, nothing untoward happened, so Lex was satisfied. It was almost time to seal the inn again with the token, so he did the last thing he had been putting off. He once again met William and Jotun. "What do you think of our offer?" the Emperor asked upon noticing the focused expression on Lex's face. "I didn't look at it," Lex responded honestly. Then he took out an ingredient at the heavenly immortal level, then another one. Since he had recognized them while searching for them to upgrade the system, it was much easier to find them now. But even so, he had only found 2, and he had no intention of depositing it to the system. "I am showing you these because I want you to know that these are just some random things I can get on my own with a little effort. Things even more valuable than this are not out of reach either. So what exactly can you offer me? And what exactly do you want from me?" Give me a straight answer, as this is the only chance I'm going to give you. The Emperor and William exchanged looks, then turned to Lex once more. If you check the envelope, you will find a method to help you properly hide your bloodline, the one that allows you to improve the potential of other humans, William said. We handed you the complete method. You can have it checked. There's nothing we're holding back. But the method is not perfect. If you work with us, we can help you by improving it. You can ask others to do so as well, but no one will be able to help you the way we can. In exchange, all we ask is you help us improve some of our people. It need not be too many. Lex's expression did not change as one of his greatest secrets was revealed. This time around, he was much more composed. After a long and detailed negotiation session, Lex finally came to an agreement with the two. Then they left. With nothing else holding him back, Lex summoned the lockdown token, and after giving all his guests one warning, activated it. The inn was, once again, sealed. Chapter 11:01 A Blessing and a Curse. The inn was once again sealed, and Lex breathed a sigh of relief. He had an innate ability to attract trouble, and he'd always come out on top, but it wasn't always good to tempt fate. Without any emergency quests or urgent tasks waiting for him, Lex could finally take his time to develop himself and the inn. Yes, in the long term it would be better if he trained in the temple of fasting rather than by himself, but since he couldn't just drop everything, sealing the inn once more was the best option. Lex pulled up his interface and looked at the quests given to him by the system. Lex extended his finger and, underneath them, began writing something. He was not adding a quest to the system interface, but rather just using an illusion to make it look like he was adding quests. On top was mastering Inferno Blade completely, following by improving his sword intent. Then came finding ways to hide his physique. For whatever reason, William and Jotun thought he had a bloodline rather than a physique, but even that knowledge was too dangerous. He did not ask them why they knew, nor did they mention it. It didn't matter. Then he added the 5-year deadline Vera had given him. It was technically a little less than 5 years now. One by one, he kept adding his objectives to his quest log. On Nether, the largest continent in the Midnight Realm, Jack made a similar list of objectives for himself. He decided ultimately to not leave the realm right now. He would improve his survivability before doing any of that, not to mention make the Jolly Rancher tougher. It would be sad if it broke while adventuring. Last but not least, he wanted even his clone to absorb at least one piece of resin as well. If he was going to have a clone, he wanted it to be the best. After a couple of years, something unexpected and unprecedented happened. The dead zone, in which Earth was trapped, suddenly welcomed the return of extremely abundant spiritual energy, changing the planet from a rating of below 1 star to above 2 stars. But with the return of that spiritual energy also came a swarm of insects that attacked not only the deities who were trying to take over Earth, but the AI as well. They were immediately recognized as the insects that had also invaded Polbitvi, under the influence of the terrorist Jeffrey. But then, without warning, something unexpected happened that rocked the entire Origin realm, and brought away the attention from the resurgence of a dead zone. A human immortal, in partnership with an emissary of the Henali court, discovered evidence that a full-fledged Jorlum had been nurtured by Fugan forces. A Jorlum was an entity that could easily destroy an entire galaxy with little effort once matured. But they had not discovered the Jorlum, only the destruction it had wrought before it was discovered. The matter was so serious that the Henali deployed their own members, no longer leaving the task of finding it to their subordinate races. If the Fugan could hide an entire Jorlum under their noses, what else could they possibly hide? The answer was simple: a lot. The discovery of the Jorlum was both a blessing and a curse. It was a blessing, because it forced the Fugan hand before they were completely ready. It was a cure because the entire Origin realm was suddenly embroiled in an unprecedented civil war. Countless races which had up until now sworn loyalty to the Henali turned sides and retaliated. Empires were fractured, and all hell broke loose. Chapter 11:02 Enigmatic Tavern Keeper. There were even clashes between the Henali and Fugan themselves, though most of those took place outside the origin realm, so no one actually knew the details. The few battles that were fought in the origin realm were fought in the void behind space, to prevent the realm itself from being destroyed. The many Tao lords who had entered the realm all became neutral parties, unwilling to take part in such a conflict. It was fine while it was just their subordinate forces fighting, but they themselves were not going to expose themselves to war. But under the guise of neutrality, they too began to plunder the origin realm. The Jotun Empire, which was the largest human force in the origin realm, lost 14 galaxies overnight. They were traitors among the humans, unsurprisingly. But, ironically, it was not the humans who led the rebellion. Instead, it was the many Henali aides who were supposed to be helping Jotun run the empire who had secretly aligned their loyalties with the Fugan. Similar scenes happened across the realm, and only extremely powerful races, such as the devils, were spared from rebellion. After all, the devils never needed help to rule their lands. All of this was the consequence of forcing the Fugan hand before they were ready, so it could only be imagined what would have happened if their preparations were complete. At the same time, rumors began to spread that the Fugan were the original rulers of the origin realm, and that the Henali were foreign invaders who had driven them out. As if to prove the rumors true, many of the strongest and oldest deities aligned with the Fugan. For a while it seemed like the Henali were on the losing end of this war. But no matter how great the momentum that the Fugan gathered, the Henali were not without their strengths as well. They held on, and ultimately unleashed a legion of celestial immortal-level Henali warriors who temporarily stabilized the situation. The girl only grunted in response, unable to muster the strength to respond properly. When she entered, her sight fell on the three triplets whose beauty had nearly toppled the city. Countless patrons visited the tavern to get a chance to catch their visage, and perhaps try their luck at winning their hearts. None had succeeded so far. She was worried for the day someone might try something foolish, such as forcefully trying to capture them, but nothing like that had happened so far, at least to her knowledge. "Ah, little huntress, have you brought in a new haul?" asked Naki, the oldest of the triplets, with a smile so pure it made even her blush. "I'll take it over to Betty and see what it's worth." "I'm assuming you want payment in spirit stones once more?" "Yes please," she answered, forgetting to change her voice to the gruff persona of the huntress. She immediately realized his mistake, which is why her next sentence sounded a lot more hoarse. "Can you tell the tavern keeper that I wish to speak with him?" "Privately." "Ah, he's on the roof waiting for you. You can make your way up. Shall I prepare a meal for you?" "A meal and a room." "Deduct the cost from my pay," she said, making her way up the many stairs. For some unknown reason, all the exhaustion she had been feeling faded away once she entered the tavern. The ache in her muscles did not go away, but at least climbing the stairs did not feel like death. She made her way to the roof and saw the enigmatic tavern keeper, sitting in his favorite lawn chair, sunbathing. He looked like a teenager, 15 years old at most, yet at the same time he was the most mysterious man she had ever met. Chapter 1103 Miss Huntress. She observed him for a moment. He looked even younger than her, and if it weren't for the fact that she had seen every single worker at the tavern come to him for instructions, she would still find it hard to believe that he was the owner of this place. Not that the Midnight Tavern was anything special. There were hundreds of taverns and inns in the outer city, and while many of them were just ordinary, some of them were quite renowned, as well. There was the Cat's Lap, which was run by Madame Lisa. Not only was she recognized as the best cook in the actual city, rumor had it that in her younger days there was a noble from the inner city who wanted to marry her. Just that story alone, alongside her famous beauty, brought in customers from all over. There was the Dawn's Den, which was famous because everyone knew that the owner was an underworld leader, but no one had ever proved it. Still, the kind of deal one could get there attracted many customers, though regular travelers also visited often. There were many more that stood out, while in comparison, the only unique thing about the Midnight Tavern was the strange material its building was made from. In fact, if anything, the tavern seemed almost too ordinary, which was also enigmatic. Even though the charm of the triplets, Naki, Nami, and Nani, had taken hold of the city, no one ever made trouble for them, which was strange. The drinks in the tavern were also unusual and weren't available anywhere else. There were rumors that even the mayor of Barren City secretly bought some bottles from them from time to time. Not that the young huntress cared for any of that. The only thing she cared about was if her suspicions about this tavern keeper were true or not. He never revealed his powers, but from the things he said, she was sure he was some kind of secretly powerful old man. Yes, I trust your books, she said as she tried to ignore the stinging pain from her various cuts and bruises. For some reason, the treatment always hurt more than the actual wounds. But then again, no one else could treat her wounds as quickly as Naki could, so it was worth it. Miss Huntress, according to the books I've read, tempering your body through actual combat will go a long way in helping you set your foundation. But it also comes back with some flaws, which is that your body is riddled with injuries that haven't had time to heal. Now that you've tempered your body, why not take some rest? Our new and improved hot tub room should prove especially useful in helping you heal and relax. Of course, if you can afford to use the best offer on the hot tub room, then just a day's worth of rest would be fine. Otherwise, I'd say you give it a few weeks of regular use before trying to break through. A few weeks of rest, she repeated, clenching her fists. She didn't have a few weeks to spend. What if I'm in a rush? What if I'm about to hunt a huge monster that will only come once, and I only have a few days left to prepare? I can't avoid it even if I want to. The tavern keeper paused his painting and turned to look at the huntress for a moment. Miss Huntress, I think you have a few things mixed up, he said after a moment. What does cultivation level have to do with hunting a big monster? If the monster you're hunting is a little more powerful than the ones you're used to, then you just need to use better tools. For now, why don't you try your hand at painting, Miss Huntress? You're clearly stressed. It won't help you come up with any answers. Here, come and see if you can paint the same symbols that I painted. Chapter 11 for the alchemist. The huntress dragged her defeated body from the roof down towards one of the hot tub rooms. She had spent the last hour painting, and she had no idea how that would help her situation at all. But that's the way it was with the tavern keeper. He never gave answers directly, and he never helped directly either. But if his guidance was useless, then she would not have come to depend on it. The answer would reveal itself with time. She paid for the hot tub level she could afford, and went inside. After making sure the room was empty and there were no secret peepholes, she was not doubting the Midnight Tavern, but she had heard rumors about such places. She stripped and then lowered her sore body into the water. Oh, she could not help but moan as the warm waters massaged her body. This was the first time she had ever spent money on such a place, but she suddenly understood the appeal. Before she could resume her thoughts about what the tavern keeper could have meant, she dozed off, which was for the best since it spared her from seeing black gunk coming out of her skin, then getting washed away with the bubbling water. At some point during the night, the huntress began to dream, as she usually did when she spent the night in the tavern. Within the dream she was painting with her finger as the brush, her chi as the paint, and the universe as her canvas. She painted the same characters that the tavern keeper, and when the characters were drawn the whole world shook around her. The huntress woke up with a start, looking around the unfamiliar room in panic. But then she remembered where she was, and took a sigh of relief. She couldn't believe she had spent the whole night in the hot tub. But surprisingly, her skin did not get wrinkled from spending too much time in the water. In fact, if anything, it seemed smoother. That's when the huntress realized that all her scars were gone. In a daze, the huntress walked to the mirror, and actually yelped. Not only were her scars gone but, the rash she had on her face since birth had vanished. How was this possible? No one had ever been able to affect them at all. Any attempt to remove the rash only made it worse, and yet now, overnight, it had vanished. The huntress touched her face, feeling dazed. Is that what she looked like without the rash? It was actually kind of cute. The huntress blushed, and was then filled with reluctance. Why couldn't this have happened just a few years ago? But it didn't matter now. She put on her clothes and once again wrapped her face in bandages, before exiting the tavern. The tavern keeper did not at all seem alarmed by the news, and instead wore an amused look. "It's quite rude to call a girl ugly, young alchemist. How do you know she isn't actually beautiful? How can she be beautiful when her own family admits that she's ugly? But that's besides the point. Even if she is beautiful, I'm not ready to get married. It will interfere with my alchemy and cultivation. I have no desire to place such a leash around my neck, holding me back. I do not want to be restrained. A wife will only be a distraction." "Young alchemist, I understand your plight, but how can I be of help? I'm just a simple tavern keeper." The alchemist rolled his eyes. That's exactly what the tavern keeper said every time, right before giving him the answer that he desired. "It seems to me that your problem is not marriage, but the control your family has over you. All you need to do is become independent and gain a backing of your own, and your family will no longer be able to influence you." Easier said than done. But I'm not at the level to pass the test of the alchemist's tower yet. How else can I gain independence and backing in just 5 days? This is a tough question. Why don't we spend a little time thinking about it? In the meantime, you should have Roan whip you up a special drink. It'll help you calm your nerves. But his special drinks are expensive, so bear that in mind. Who cares about that? If there's anything I have, it's money, said the alchemist, heading back down. Although it seemed like the tavern keeper had not given him an answer, in fact he had already done so very clearly. He knew by now that nothing the tavern keeper said was ever simple, and nothing about this tavern was mundane. He couldn't wait to see how that drink would help him out. Chapter 1105 A Tavern Keeper's Work. The alchemist rushed to the bar and ordered a drink called Roan's Special. Roan's Special was genuinely a special drink, because Roan would make a different drink depending on who the person ordering the drink was. Nobody knew exactly how Roan decided which drink which customer needed when the special was ordered, but to date there had never been a customer who had been disappointed by the drink. In fact, many people wished to have it again, but there was a 1-per-month rule which meant they could only order it once a month. This was perhaps the most contested rule of the tavern. But since the rules could not be changed, on the first of every month a special group of customers gathered who might not be seen at the tavern at any other time, but they were always there on the first. So far, the alchemist had avoided these drinks because he could not bear to get intoxicated. An alchemist's mind was their most valuable asset, so to dull it on purpose was almost like a sin. But the alchemist had too much trust in the tavern keeper, so today he indulged. The drink was minty fresh, and instead of intoxicating, gave the alchemist a sudden jolt of mental energy and clarity that he had lacked before. Suddenly, the alchemist fell into a daze, which made some of the regular customers chuckle. They could identify a newbie a mile away. The first time was always a memorable experience. But the alchemist sensed none of that, for his thoughts were mired in all the alchemy recipes and knowledge he had ever gathered. So many things suddenly started to make sense in such a simple way that the alchemist almost couldn't believe he never caught on before. At the same time, many of the notions he previously held to be true did not seem plausible anymore, and actually seemed to reduce the efficiency of his refining. How could he have never seen that before? By the time the alchemist woke up from his daze it was evening, but he didn't even notice. He left Roan a hefty tip as he ran out the door, going as fast as he could. He had no time to waste. When her family, angered by her disclosing their behavior and secrets, tried to attack her to force her back on stage, the girl used some special technique that brought everyone to their knees. Even the veritable Foundation Realm family head of her family was brought to his knees, unable to move, as she marched out. Her final words before leaving were a declaration that she would also look into the death of her mother, and if she discovered that someone from the family had been behind it, she would be back for revenge. The story had rocked the entire city, and was the hot gossip that everyone was talking about. But a lesser-known piece of gossip, that only very few people heard about, was that the young alchemist had been brought by his master to the nearby wildlands to harvest a very special herb, but was attacked by a wild beast. Before his master, who was not adept in combat, could do anything, a young maiden of unmatched grace and beauty saved him. No one knew who she was or where she came from, but her valor had won the day, and some said, the young alchemist's heart. Lex, who was sitting in the rumor room, chuckled as he read the slips that updated him on all the latest gossip. Nami knocked on the door and popped her head in. Tavern keeper, that old stinky man is back again. He's thanking you for helping him find the perfect disciple who can represent him in the upcoming alchemy tournament. But he's saying he's never taught a disciple before, and he's already almost got his disciple killed, so he's lost all nerve. He's asking to see you to seek advice on how he should teach him. Send him to the roof, Lex said, as he got up from his chair. A tavern keeper's work was never done. Chapter 1106 School of. After sending away the alchemist master with some indirect advice, Lex walked down to the bar. He was anticipating a certain customer today who was the talk of the town, though no one knew his real identity. The only reason Lex knew his identity was because he could secretly encompass the whole city with his spirit sense. Most days, when he was free, he would sit on the roof and observe the city with his spirit sense. One would think it would get boring after a while, but it was actually quite interesting. There was more suspense and drama happening in real life than countless TV shows, it was just that no one else was watching, and the people involved hardly ever enjoyed the suspense. There was also a lot of comedy. Late in the evening, a customer walked in, long hair covering most of his features. His clothes looked ordinary, and there seemed to be nothing about him that particularly drew any attention. He seemed perfect to blend into the background of the city. Find updated novels at novelhall.com. He sat down in a corner and ordered a drink, and seemed more than happy to be forgotten. If this had been any other tavern, his technique, which allowed him to be easily overlooked, would have worked wonders. As it was, the triplet sisters never overlooked a single customer, always making sure they were well tended to. The extra attention made him uncomfortable, but he did not display it in any way. He was content to just silently sit and listen to the conversations in the room as he enjoyed his one drink. Besides the wedding scandal, the guests talked about a number of random things, with one of the hottest topics being the surging criminal element in the city. But, as ordinary folk, all they usually talked about was their neighbor who got robbed, or something they saw on the street. After a few hours, after being unable to pick up on the news he was hoping to hear about, the man finally walked to the bar. Usually Ron was there, but for tonight, Lex had taken over himself. Need another drink? Lex asked casually, not paying any special attention to the man. Inside the Midnight Inn, there was a hurricane of molten lava that had been going for weeks. Some guests thought that it was a new phenomenon and so had come over to take a look. Many began to picnic in front of it, and began to place bets about how long it would keep going. Ordinarily, such a thing would be too dangerous to get close to, but since the hurricane had technically not moved from its spot from the very start, everyone was very comfortable with it. Not only was it an interesting sight, who knew if it might spout out some treasure? In the past 15 years, countless guests at the inn had discovered extremely valuable treasures inside the Midnight Inn, and were informed that they were free to take them. But the condition was that they don't harm the surroundings, and in the case that it was a treasure that could continuously reappear, cut off its roots or point of origin. It was like a game of treasure hunting, except the treasures were real and they could keep them. But today, after weeks, the hurricane finally did something different. It began to shrink, oddly enough. Some thought that upon shrinking enough, the hurricane might explode, but that did not happen. Instead, the molten lava eventually cooled down, and the hurricane slowed down until it eventually faded. From within the fire, a meditating figure was revealed. Lex, after finally completing his latest cultivation system, opened his eyes. As of late, he had begun meditating inside his technique Heaven's Furnace, and used the dragon's breath glyph to fill it with fire. He was raising his tolerance to his own dragon fire before trying it out with actual dragon fire, since Pell Jr. was on the verge of being able to control its giant dragon body. Admittedly, it had taken much longer than anticipated because there was a lot more to dragon fire than Lex originally guessed. But today, finally, he had reached the level of complete immunity. Tomorrow, he would try with the real deal. Chapter 1107 Stressful. Unlike many of the many whims he enacted in his early cultivation days, Lex was well aware of the dangers he would face by cultivating with dragon fire. He also took into account the fact that the dragon who would be breathing that fire was 2 major realms greater than himself, and those were 2 immortal levels. But he was still confident, and the reason for that was the thorough preparation he had taken for this. Over the past 15 years, Lex had been focused solely on filling in the massive knowledge gaps he had when it came to cultivation, as well identifying the direction for his future growth. Naturally, the many quests he completed for his system and their rewards had helped him in this as well. Getting accustomed to the 2 differing flows of time, one in the origin realm and one in the midnight realm, was actually much easier than he guessed. As a result, he had his tavern travel the origin realm while he used his projection to complete his quests over there, while here he focused on self-improvement. So, while the tavern was out in the origin realm for about 5 years, Lex had been tempering himself for 15 years. He had forced himself to slow down his cultivation, for it was absolutely ready to improve, to not only temper himself, but also so that he could get a better understanding of how he wanted to proceed. Becoming an immortal required Lex to define his tenets of immortality. If he had continued to use regal embrace, he would have had only one tenet, and that would have been absolute defense. But since he did not, Lex had to decide on those for himself. The tenets were exceptionally important as they would define the foundation of his power and growth in the immortal realms, so he took his time over the past few years and thought about this in great detail. During this time, he also took his time and properly settled into the midnight realm and became fully accustomed to it. He adventured to his heart's content, and for once enjoyed not being pathetically weak compared to everyone else for once. This was very important, as his midnight tavern had to remain exceptionally low-key for the last few years. With the whole realm at war, high-powered cultivators were even more active, which is one of the things that prompted him to learn how to remain hidden behind the scenes. Unless absolutely necessary, he used the tavern to fulfill all his quests and change the destinies of many, all without attracting attention to himself and the tavern. She still did not mention what it was about, but only a few days ago she came back and reminded him that the deadline was approaching. She was mainly worried that the inn wouldn't open in time and he wouldn't be able to go. At the same time, she was also worried about herself. Since they had spent 15 years here, all of them were 15 years older. Vera was finally old enough to date, but had been stuck here unable to search for her destined beloved. Yes, that meant that Vera had reached the age of 30 without getting a single boyfriend. If they were going by soul age, Lex had also crossed the age of 30, though his physical age was only 15. Like him, all the workers at the inn were technically physically teenagers as well, though good old Jimmy and his gang of peacock warriors had officially entered their 20s. Lex couldn't help but sigh. They grow up so fast, he said. Fortunately, Gerard and Lilith were still only just dating and hadn't moved on from that yet. Dating for multiple centuries was a very common thing among devils, so she didn't see that as odd. Lex wouldn't know what he'd do if Gerard, like Harry, had a kid. Being an uncle was surprisingly stressful. Lex teleported away to the cosmic sea, pushing his thoughts away. It was time for a quick dip, and hopefully he would keep himself from being assimilated by the sea this time. Chapter 1109 Insanity. Even if he might not be planning on swimming, he walked into the sea right up until his knees were submerged, and began resisting the assimilation. It was not an easy task, and was the only experience he ever encountered that he couldn't build a resistance to by cultivating in this condition. Maybe he needed to meet some criteria to start building up a resistance to it. But until he figured that out, he would just train manually. Lex managed to resist the sea for several hours before his energy began to run low, so he took a break. After saying farewell to Nemo, he teleported back to his meditation room and began to recover while sitting atop the dragon's head. After years of using the dragon's body to strengthen himself, Lex assumed that the body might actually weaken. That was actually the plan for how to get Pell Jr. to take over the body. But the reality of the situation was quite different. The incredibly pure spiritual energy of the realm constantly replenished the body's energy, as well as bathed and purified it. Over time, it was beginning to become even stronger. The only good thing was that after 15 years of constant cultivation, Pell Jr. was becoming strong enough to barely control the body for a fraction of a second. For today's purpose, that would be enough. Once Lex was back in peak condition, he invited Luther into his meditation room, wearing firefighting gloves, the quest reward he got for creating tribulation rooms. Ordinarily, considering his unique physique, he would not need gloves to handle fire, but this was dragon fire from an immortal so. Lex took out the Dragonburn locket, something he had received a long time ago. It contained the secrets of fire breathing, and was an excellent tool for newborn dragons to learn about it. In this case, the locket would help Pell Jr. use fire breath to begin with, as it was too much of a strain on it. Once he put the locket on the dragon's body, he stood in front of the dragon and made some preparations. He used the system to put up some barriers around Luther, for protection, but for himself he only used his own techniques. As he held the tiny flame in his hand, ignoring the pain of the very meat his body was made of cooking, a gleam of excitement flashed through Lex's eyes. He had not decided yet, but Lex was experimenting with the idea of having his tenet be about being the best at whatever he did. If he wanted the best defense in the universe, surpassing even regal embrace, and the best offense which surpassed even Mo's blessing, then he might as well continue the trend. There was a small part of his brain which was logical that told him that he was essentially setting himself up for failure by having such goals. But then there was another part of his brain that was more adventurous that told him not to take everything so seriously. If he was going to live life, he might as well live it trying to do something extraordinary. Lex hadn't finalized what he was going to do yet, but he was giving himself a taste of what life might be like if he decided to be so extreme. It would be a series of unreasonable, unbelievable, completely insane events and obstacles that he would need to regularly overcome just to have the faintest hope of living up to such a tenet. As Lex felt the dragonfire burn him, and use his very soul as kindling to keep itself burning, he oddly found that the only thing he could focus on was the question of whether he could cultivate using this fire. It would surely burn his meridians if he tried. But then again, he had already reconstructed his meridians after being turned into a meat patty, so what was a little fire damage? He began to cultivate, and absorbed some of that dragon fire. Chapter 11:10 A Cool Sword. Pain was something Lex no longer acknowledged. It was not that he had gone crazy, though there was a particular patch of grass that regularly accused him of such, but that over the past few years he had come to realize that most pain was just an evolutionary tool that was relevant back when he was mortal, but was no longer so. Pain, back when he was mortal, told his body that there was an issue. The more severe the pain, the more severe the issue. But now, he had complete and total awareness of his body, as well as an in-depth understanding of what his body could tolerate. The same was true of his soul. But his body still felt pain, even for wounds and injuries that would heal in a matter of minutes. So once he reached a point of sufficient willpower and self-awareness, pain was something he could just tune out. Even without pain, he would know if there was something wrong with him. For example, right now, Lex did not need to feel the mind-numbing pain of his meridians being seared as energy that was akin to liquid fire coursed through his body to know that he was being cooked inside and out. If anything, the pain was just his brain being discourteous about Lex's efforts. But the answer was extremely clear. Lex could not cultivate with this fire yet, and if he stayed in its proximity for more than a couple of minutes he would be in serious trouble. His hand had already turned black, with much of his flesh already gone. New W Novels updates at novelhall.com. But it wasn't as if there were no gains. He definitely benefited from this, but it would just take him a very long time to recover from this injury, which meant this was not something he could try again. Lex remained satisfied with the result, since his main goal was to just get his hands on the fire, not actually successfully temper himself with it. He walked to Luther, who sealed the small fire within the gloves, containing it perfectly. "You good?" he asked, looking at his black, bony hand. The dragonfire of a real dragon was the last ingredient that was needed, though these flames were not meant to light their forges or melt the metals in their ores. Instead, these flames were an ingredient in the sword itself. The other ingredients were no less rare or powerful than dragonfire, so there was no risk of the flames overpowering the rest of the sword. The metal used in the sword was beetaville, which was the first metal formed in the Midnight Realm. There was only a finite amount in the entire realm, and it would never be formed again since only the birth of a realm could cause it to form. Besides that, the sword contained a fragment of the first ever unicorn's horn, the first scale ever shed by the world serpent, the blood of Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse deity, the sound of the waves of the cosmic sea, and the strongest memory of the heavenly tree. When Lex first heard the requirements for the sword, he thought there might have been some mistake, but the dwarves really managed to capture the abstract, and used sound and memory in the forging process. Now only 3 ingredients remained. The handle would be made from a piece of Lex's bone, which he had to provide fresh from his body, the dragonfire, and to bring it all together, his sword and tent. Orin himself would complete the forging process, which had been ongoing for almost 8 years now. Today would be the last day, and Lex admitted to himself that he felt great anticipation. Beside the 2 butter knives, he had never had a consistent weapon of his own. Although he was not a sword fanatic, and nothing could replace the sheer satisfaction of punching his enemies right in the face, a cool sword was also a must. Not to mention, if he was to embark on the journey to be the best, which he had not decided yet, then even his sword had to be the best. Luther and Lex walked deep into the dwarven forges until finally they arrived at a pool of lava. Beside it, a shirtless dwarf was hammering away at something unseen. It was time.